Here's a question from Ashir Mayerify.
Okay.
My best attempt. Who wants to know, why did God create us as fleshly human beings if our eventual permanent state as Christians is to be eternal spiritual beings? Now, when did the Bible say that? The answer is it didn't. This is what's known as Gnosticism, which is a heresy, a very early heresy in the church that read into the Bible Greek culture rather than Hebrew culture, the actual perspective that the Bible was written from. The Greeks believed that the spirit was good and that the flesh was evil. And so this Gnostic heresy either ended up creating two bizarre categories: people who went full hedonist and said, well, since nothing we do in the body matters to God, he's completely distant from it, do whatever you want, it'll ultimately be done away with, and then you can just be your spirit person in the end. And then there were other people who went full ascetic and said that we must distance ourselves from everything physical.
Got to beat that body down.
Yeah, and the Bible has strong words against both. Paul himself wrote in Timothy very, very sound debunking of this perspective and mindset in 1 Timothy chapter 3, I believe, where he noted that these things, the food, the body, the pleasure that comes with both, are created from God and are to be enjoyed if sanctified by the word of God in prayer. Now, he seems to make a conjoining of the flesh and spirit, but that's in this life. What about the next? Well, when it comes to calling out, and again, don't think that this rebuke is because we think you're a false teacher. I won't attempt to pronounce your username again. We want to make sure that you understand this.
Ashy.
So, Ashy,
Yeah.
5 biblical passages that I want you to keep in mind and to study on your own time further, and perhaps ask further questions about in the future in order to understand our perspective on our eternal bodies. The first and the most direct is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and the whole chapter is worth something, but in specifics, the last 20 verses, 43 through 63. The second is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the opening verses, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. The one that I'm going to read first is 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. That'll be the third. The fourth is going to be Jesus' appearance to his disciples in the Gospel of John chapter 21, where he gives a demonstration of this last point, which is in Luke chapter 24 and verse 39. So again, if you're taking notes, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the closing 20 verses, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the opening verses, the 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, John chapter 22, and I will give the specific verse for that. That would be, that's basically the first 14 verses, but we'll note that point. He's going to eat in their presence. And then the most direct and significant is Luke 24 and verse 39. Not bad for off the cuff.
Yeah.
Now, let's start with 1 Corinthians. Actually, let's start in Luke 24. I'll go backwards because I think this will build on the same point. In Luke chapter 24, Jesus has risen from the dead. The disciples are getting their 50 days of appearances before he ascends into heaven. So this is pre the book of Acts,
Right.
but not yet post the ministry of Jesus on the earth. Now, this is where we expect Jesus, post-resurrection, to be showcasing what? His permanent abode, perhaps.
Right.
Maybe he's taking on a temporary body like the Old Testament, but let's see. In Luke chapter 24 and let's start in verse 36. Now, as they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were frightened and terrified and supposed they had seen a spirit. Now, here's where Jesus clarifies, right? This is your eternal estate. Of course I'm going to be a spirit, but it's me. I'm the Spirit.
Right.
No, it says in verse 38, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." So there's this ongoing description, not to be interrupted, by the way. You have to read that into the passage.
Right.
Of Jesus saying, I'm not a spirit, it's me. But wait, I thought the me is the spirit. Aren't we trying to get away from this body according to Christianity? No, because Christianity is determined by Christ. And post-resurrection, he had meat. Note that point. Now, building on that point, this isn't just something that he put on for show. His fashion also had function. This is John chapter 21, what I was sputtering sentences fragments out earlier, where Jesus asked the disciples, of course, if they have any food, to bring what they caught. And in verse 12, he tells them to come and eat breakfast. None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" knowing it was the Lord. Then he came, took bread, and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. When he asked Peter if he loves him, what's he doing? He's eating with them.
Right.
He's breaking bread with them. He's eating breakfast.
He even made the breakfast.
Yeah, so note that point.
Yeah.
Now, that's important to note because we see not just a functional, an appearance of Jesus in a body, but a function of Jesus as a body. Now, this is something that's going to be ongoing. Now, when the followers of Jesus are taking this point away, and wondering what are the implications of that, the Apostle Paul made an observation about the resurrection, and the opening verses talk about Jesus' resurrection, but specifically what it means to us. And let's start in verse 39. It says, "All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, another of birds. There are also celestial bodies, terrestrial bodies, and the glory of the celestial is one, the glory of the terrestrial is another. Another glory of the sun, glory of the moon, glory of the stars. They differ from one another, in glory. So also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption. It is raised." What is raised?
The body.
In corruption.
Yeah.
So he's still speaking of a body, just without the lack of glory that is
Right.
being shown as distinct from animals, from fish, from stars. But notice this, and this is where we need to clarify terms. It's sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. Now we pause here and say, so does that mean that our next body, our dwelling place, if you will, is spirit, not flesh? That would be reading into the text, not just because the passage goes on to note these are in fact bodies, abodes, but when we're talking about the resurrection, who does the Apostle Paul reference as an example of that spiritual body? He says in verse 45, and this is quoting Genesis, "So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit." So if the first Adam, the physical body, right? His
Right.
name means dirt,
Yeah.
right? Adam, made from the earth. He had a physical body. Did Jesus not have a physical body? Is that what we're supposed to take out of this?
Absolutely not.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Because what? Jesus' work for us was spirit. Adam's work on us, if you will, was flesh. This is speaking of the work of the resurrection, not our etymology, if you want to use the word. So follow his point when he continues on. The spiritual is not the first, but the natural. Afterward, the spiritual. The first man was made of the earth, made of dust. The second man is the Lord from heaven. If there's any question as to who's the second. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are made of dust. And as is the heavenly man, so are those who are heavenly. And we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. So what is Paul getting at here? He's saying that this body, in resemblance to Adam, is going to be raised in resemblance to who? The Lord in
Right.
heaven, Jesus.
Right.
Now, if that's clear enough, and building on the last point that we've already established in Luke, what did Jesus show us? That he has a incorporeal body, that we're supposed to be spiritual beings living forever in heaven? No, we have a physical dwelling place, but it's not like the one here. It is capable of more, and yet the same. Why? Because we no longer bear our fallen sinful nature. The work of Adam has been undone. Continuing on this point, and in the context of judgment, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 begins with this point. For if we know that our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a
Right.
house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So Paul makes a point of contrast and an illustration. Obviously, we aren't living tents and living houses, but a tent, a temporary living place,
Right.
and a house, a permanent dwelling place, is the same kind of comparison he will go on to make in reference to what? This earthly body and our heavenly body. It's not to say that the tent is physical and the house is, invisible. He's saying what? That there's a big difference. And the second one we will have and enjoy forever. This one will wear out. That house will not. And that's his point of emphasis, which you can read in the next 8 verses. But again, for the sake of time, just note the point. I'll finish with where I said I'd start. Apologies for that. In 1 John chapter 3, in case it isn't clear, and you think I'm assuming, I'm reading into the passage, that Jesus not remaining who he was when he appeared to the apostles. I'm kind of dodging over the fact that, of course, Jesus appeared in a body, but he isn't a body post-resurrection. Let's read in 1 John chapter 3, where we see an ongoing expectation of him as he is, not as he was or as he's now become. 1 John chapter 3, behold what manner of love a Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. Therefore the world does not know us, because it did not know him. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not yet been revealed what we shall be. But we know that when he is revealed, who's the he being referenced? God. We shall be, like him. For we shall see him as he is. And everyone who has this hope in himself purifies himself just as he is pure. Now, I read John chapter 4, and it says that God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. But I don't see a spirit, right? It's not a physical thing. So what can I see if, according to the same book, John chapter 1, the only begotten of the Son, the Father, the Son has revealed him.
Right.
He's the one that we can see. He's the one that we can touch, handle, taste in some bizarre context. But continuing on with that point and cross-referencing our examinations, and again, we could go about this all night. Revelation chapter 22, Jesus concludes that letter and that prophecy, what? By saying he is the root, spiritual, and offspring, physical, of David. What does that mean? He's still a physical descendant of King David.
Yes,
he still
absolutely.
bears that physical body. When we read passages like 1 John chapter 3, we have an expectation of what? What Jesus showed us. His resurrection body, his permanent dwelling place, eternal in the heavens. Was it invisible? No, he said the exact opposite and demonstrated the exact opposite in Luke 24 and in John 21. So, and then building on the Apostle Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15, there is a difference between this body and that, but the differences aren't physical. It isn't that one's physical and one's spiritual. It's noting the spiritual nature of the new man is
Right.
different from the spiritual nature of this man. And we can go into Romans 7 and all that fun stuff at another time. But here's the point that we want you to take away from this. Are we supposed to be disembodied spirits? No, that's a
No.
false assumption regarding Christian teaching. But if that's in fact the case, where do we get that information from? We get it from the life, example, and teachings of Jesus, what all Christianity should be determined by. So if you ask a question and say, since this, hold on, because that since might put you in a cinch if it's not based on this.
Yeah.
Make sure that you understand what you already know, quote unquote, about Christianity, not based on what Christians have told you or what you've assumed Christians believe, but what the Bible actually says. And this will require some digging. Obviously, there's not going to be like a subchapter where it says the example of Jesus's, pre-heavenly, post-heavenly body or something, right? You have to form these conclusions with more information. And that's why these shows exist, because we're paying attention to those things. But when we are asked questions, make sure that you challenge yourself even on those things. Since this is true, and it's not, why is this false? Well, it's not false because that statement that you made that you assumed was true is false. That's the one that leads to the confusion.
Yeah.
So let us know if that helps you out, individual with a long username.
And just to sum it all up, maybe the best takeaway from all of this, because it does get pretty complicated, is this. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 49, Paul says, and as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. As you did so well, Sean, at the beginning of this conversation, the best way to understand where we're going and what we're going to be about in eternity is to take a look at how Jesus presented himself post-resurrection before his ascension. He was able to be touched. He was able to eat. He was able to be interactive with people. People didn't put out their hands and it would go right through him like the Gnostics used to teach. They teach that if he walked on the seashore, he wouldn't leave footprints. Boy, that would have killed a lot of greeting cards down through time. But the bottom line is, when we take a look at how Jesus interacted with people, he even asked Thomas, "See here my hands, see here my side. Put forth your finger, put it into the wounds in my hands, put your hand in my side. Be not unbelieving, but believing." You got to have a physical being to be able to do that. But it was more than physical. That physical was also supernatural, which is why Jesus could enter a building without using the door, which he did, and freaked the disciples out. So
traveling at the speed of thought.
Yeah.
So obviously physics is out the window, and yet physical hasn't.
Yeah,
New rules.
exactly.
That's the point.
Yeah, supernatural. The natural isn't thrown out, but it is supernatural. It is beyond and above the existence that we have in our bodies now. Yeah.
So
Hopefully that helps.